This is Behind the Scenes. I'm Scott Sexsmith. A Collingwood landlord is living in fear, and a backlog of cases with the Landlord-Tenant Board isn't helping matters. Collingwood Today reporter Jessica Owen is here with the details. Jess, let's start with Alex Bullock's story. What can you tell us about her situation?
So Alex Bullock lives in Collingwood. She bought a house there 2 years ago. And she had a great tenant to start. And then in February of 2022, she took on a second tenant because her first tenant had moved out. And since then, she's had a lot of issues with that tenant that she's been trying to address. She served that tenant eventually with the notice of eviction in June, and she is waiting until March for a date at the Landlord-Tenant Board to actually deal with that eviction. And since she served her tenant with that notice of eviction, her tenant stopped paying rent altogether. So her tenant is essentially living rent-free in her accessory apartment.
Wow, that's a crazy story. Jess, how did you first learn about Alex's story?
So it was kind of unique, actually. So normally, for the most part, we don't write a lot of stories about landlord-tenant disputes just because we're well aware that there's a backlog at the Landlord-Tenant Board. And so there's tons of people out there with these stories. And unless I wanted to become a landlord and tenant reporter only, we just don't have the time to address all of the concerns that we hear about. But this story stood out a little bit because the neighbors of this home started a petition that they eventually sent to the mayor and all the members of council, which was dealt with at council this past week. And I think in the 14 years of being a reporter, it's the first time I've ever seen a landlord-tenant dispute come before the municipal council. So that's how I heard about it. And then I reached out to Alex and her mother, Andrea Leeming, and took it from there.
So speaking of politicians, I know that Alex and other landlords have reached out to Simcoe Grey MPP Brian Saunderson. What is he saying, and are there any plans to help expedite resolutions here?
Yeah, so Simcoe Grey MPP Brian Saunderson is also the parliamentary assistant to the Attorney General. So this is an issue that is specifically within his wheelhouse of issues he's dealing with at Queen's Park. And he said that there is a plan to hire, currently there are 70 adjudicators at the Landlord and Tenant Board, and they're expecting to add 14 more, so up to 84 in the first quarter of 2024 to help address this backlog. But some are saying that that's still not quite enough. If you think that there are 444 municipalities across Ontario that may need these services, 86 adjudicators may seem like a lot, but when you compare it to the 444 municipalities, it's still not quite hitting what they might need. But he says that making that change will mean that they're hoping to reduce the 5-month current wait time for issues to be addressed down to 3 months by adding those new adjudicators in the beginning of 2024.
Jess, finally, before we let you go, what do you hope is the takeaway from this story?
I hope the takeaway is that a lot of times with stories like this, it becomes a landlord versus tenant issue. And I hope what people take away from this story is there are good landlords out there and there are good tenants out there, but that both are suffering due to these delays of the Landlord-Tenant Board.
All right. Collingwood Today reporter Jessica Owen. Thanks for this, Jess, and thanks for taking us behind the scenes.